Hey, how's everybody doing tonight? Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be with you. It is Saturday night here in New York City. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. My wife is in the other room watching TV, so we don't have the famous bookshelf tonight, unfortunately. Instead, we're just here in the bedroom, but that's okay. Got a great evening, great chat we're gonna have tonight. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. The way we do things here is that I give my opening remarks, and then we do the roll call where we call out everyone who's watching, names and locations. We see who's watching from around the country, around the world, and then I answer your super chat questions for the rest of the night. That's how we do it here. So if you have something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, shoot me a super chat. I would really appreciate that. And I guess with no further ado, let's jump right into it.
That the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right. Welcome, everybody. A lot going on in the world. The war in Ukraine is continuing. The hysteria in the United States against Russia is continuing. The pressure trying to separate Russia and China is continuing. We have Joe Biden warning that there might be food shortages here in the United States. Can you imagine that? Food shortages in the United States. We have Joe Biden calling for the Russian president to be removed from office. A lot of crazy things to talk about. But since it's Saturday night, and a lot of what we really like to talk a lot about on here is history, the history of our movement, of the class struggle in the United States, of socialist and revolutionary organizations in the United States and the work that they do. I actually wanted to use my opening remarks tonight to go over the history of something that not much is known about, though there's plenty of survivors or veterans of it still living today, which is the new communist movement of the 1970s. From about 1970 till about 1982, you had a large group of Americans. It was around, 50,000 to 100,000 Americans who were involved in efforts to build some kind of new communist party that was inspired by China. And their story, which I have studied, and there's a lot written about it. Not a lot, but there's a few books that have come out in the last few years about the history of these efforts to build a new communist party aligned with China. I wanted to talk about the new communist movement. And another thing that I haven't done before very much on these streams is I haven't shown clips. And now that we're using StreamYard, we're not doing this from my phone, we have the ability to show clips. So I'm actually going to show clips. But there have been a few good books that have come out about the new communist movement. And what the Center for Political Innovation is advocating right now when we put out this notion of out of the movement to the masses, a lot of that is rooted in studying the new communist movement, the successes and the failures of the new communist movement in the 1970s. And thank you, Herb Bryant, for the super chat. Much appreciated. So I think it's important that we just talk about it. And tonight we're going to talk about it with some actual video. The new communist movement, it started out basically, so everyone knows about the political upsurge in the 1960s, right? In the 1960s, you had, the civil rights movement that had started in the 50s was getting stronger. The passage of the Civil Rights Act, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You had the Vietnam War, and there were protests against the Vietnam War. I can definitely, talk about that. Let me write that down. Thank you, David. had protests against the Vietnam War, mass anti-war demonstrations, and then 1968, you had at that point you had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Almost every urban center in the United States went up in flames of rebellions of the African American community. You had protests at the Democratic National Convention because the majority of Democrats wanted to end the Vietnam War, but the Democratic Party nominated Hubert Humphrey, who was a pro-war candidate. And so there were riots outside the Democratic National Convention. And, you know, it was just an upsurge of political activism in the United States. But among the broad masses of Americans, you didn't have such activism. It was limited to the Black community, where you had organizations like the Black Panther Party spring up, and it was limited to college campuses. And it was tended to be more upper middle class campuses, Columbia University, Harvard, you know, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and San Francisco, and in the Bay Area, et cetera. And there was a feeling among a lot of the people who got radicalized in this period that the United States needed a new communist party that was aligned with China. We know that China was at that point saying the Soviet Union was revisionist or social imperialist. And there was a feeling that the Soviet Union was not revolutionary enough, but Mao was, you know, leading the beacon of world revolution. So you had a number of Americans who were part of what they called the New Communist Movement. And it was an attempt to form a new communist party among the broad masses of Americans. They got jobs in factories. They sold their newspapers, and they tried to set up shop in working class communities. And they were not successful. And the reason that they were not successful was because the USA at that point still had a very, very strong economy. Among industrial workers in the United States, there was enough economic prosperity that people weren't interested in socialism, right? You know, the American middle class, that American dream was there. And there was just so much economic prosperity that among white workers, there was not really an audience for this. And it's kind of a sad story. But what is not told, though, and this is very interesting, is there were a couple pockets of success where the new communist movement was very successful. And one of the places that the new communist movement was very successful was Detroit. And this is actually a very good book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, by Dan Georgakis and Marvin Sorkin. This is a history. It's called A Study in Urban Revolution. This is a history of the new communist movement in Detroit, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And among African-American auto workers, you did have, you know, a large number of them joining what was called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. You had a mayor in Detroit, Coleman Young, who was elected, who was considered kind of an ally of the communist movement. You had a communist, like an actual Maoist communist judge who was elected, who like quoted Mao's little red book from the bench. And so, you know, you did have a pocket of success for the new communist movement in Detroit, for example. And actually, there's a documentary that was made about it called Finally Got the News, because so basically what happened was in Detroit, you had a lot of auto workers who made automobiles. They made cars. They called it Motor City. But among the auto workers, among the black auto workers, there was a feeling that the United Auto Workers Union didn't represent them and didn't, you know, support their interests. So they formed something called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, DRUM. And DRUM was like a communist faction of the United Auto Workers Union, DRUM. And DRUM it led what they called wildcat strikes, which would be strikes that were not permitted by the union. 1974 was Wildcat Summer in Detroit. And, you know, when they would protest against the United Auto Workers Union for being reformist and not being revolutionary enough, the chant that they would do, they would chant, "We finally got the news about how our dues, we finally got the news about how our dues are being used." So there's this great documentary that was made about the black auto workers of Detroit and the United Auto Workers Union. So I'm actually going to play a clip from it that is particularly good, that kind of shows you the rhetoric that was used by the new communist movement, by the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. This was a group of black communist auto workers in 1972, 73, 74, and they put together this little documentary. This is a clip from it, and I believe the voice speaking is Ken Cockrell. Ken Cockrell, who was a black communist lawyer in Detroit in this time period. And this is a clip of him kind of laying out, you know, explaining his worldview. And this is really good. I wish more people could see this clip. This is him explaining the viewpoint of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement.
Wages and so forth, and then they steal all that shit back from you in terms of the way he got his other things set up. His whole credit gimmick society, man, consumer credit, buy shit on credit. He give you a little bit of shit to cool your ass out, and then steal all that shit back with shit called interest, the price of money. Motherfuckers are non-producing, non-existent, industries, motherfuckers who deal with paper. There's a cat who will stand up and say to you, he's in mining. And he sits in an office, man, on the 199th floor in some motherfucking building on Wall Street, and he's in mining. And he has paper, certificates, which are embroidered and shit, stocks, bonds, debentures, obligations, He's in mining. And he's sitting up in Wall Street, and his fingernails ain't been dirty in his motherfucking life. He went to Phillips Andover or Exeter. He went to Harvard. He went to Yale. He went to the Wharton School of Business, and he's in mining. And the motherfuckers who deal with intangibles are the motherfuckers who are rewarded in this society. The more abstract and intangible your shit is, i.e. stocks. What is stocks? A stock certificate is evidence of ownership in something that's real. Ownership. He owns and controls and therefore receives, the benefit from. That's what they call profit. He fucking with shit in Bolivia. He fucking with shit in Chile. He's Kennecott. He's Anaconda. He's United Fruit. He's in mining. He's in what? He ain't never in his life produced shit. Investment bankers, stock brokers, insurance men. It's motherfuckers who don't do nothing. We see that this whole society, man, exists and rests upon workers, and that this whole motherfucking society controlled by this ruling clique is parasitic, vulturistic, cannibalistic, and is sucking and destroying, man, the life of motherfucking workers, and we have to stop it because it's evil.
There's a lot of confusion amongst white people in this country, amongst white workers in this country about who the enemy is. The same contradictions of overproduction, the same contradictions of increasing production are prevalent within the white working class. But because of the immense resources of propaganda, publicity, radio, television, journals, magazines, and so on and so forth, which can be drawn upon, white people tend to get a little bit confused about who the enemy is. If you take a look at, white workers in Flint, for instance, in the automobile industry, who are pretty hard pressed because the Buick plant up there is whipping their ass. And it's whipping their ass about twice as hard today as it was 5 years ago. But who do they think the enemy is? The nigga on the street. Crime in the streets, was the problem. Or black people, moving into our neighborhood, causing housing prices to decline and threatening to rape our wives and daughters, And as a result, you get a cat like George Wallace who comes along. And George Wallace is not the first of the populist fascists in this country. And George Wallace talks about how the big, fat cats of Wall Street are messing up the country. It's the little man that's suffering because of, the big, rich financial bears of Wall Street in conjunction and in alliance with the niggas. And the white folks, the white workers tend to buy that shit up. They tend to eat it up. They tend to love it. That's not in Birmingham, Alabama that I'm talking about. That's in Flint, Michigan. As a result of that kind of thing, millions and millions of white workers in this country just don't understand what's going down and end up becoming counter-revolutionary, even though the contradictions which they face every day would say that they should be the most staunch revolutionaries. Black people represent, the most forward and progressive and militant movement inside the plant, which are calling not for, in reality, they ain't calling for the destruction, of, the white working class. The demands which are being presented, are demands which are calling for an uplifting of the working class as a whole. And the actual fact of the matter is that the movement of black workers is a class movement that's calling for a total change in the relationship between workers and owners altogether. And what it's saying is that certainly we don't want all the shitty and lowest paying jobs in the plant. Certainly we don't want to be, most exploited people in the plant, and we aren't calling for anybody to be exploited. We're calling for the elimination of exploitation in the plants. We're calling for the elimination of racism in the plants. We're calling for the elimination of any kind of conditions inside of the plant, which are bad, for the basic, health and enjoyment, of life. We are not calling for the replacement of the black proletariat, with white workers, who happen to be in a higher stage in the ladder. We are not calling for a situation in which white oppressors will be replaced by black oppressors. We are calling for the ending of oppression altogether. Basically the reason that they're racist is because of the fact that they're afraid, that the little bit of niche that they got in society is going to be lost. But ain't nobody been trying to demonstrate to them that rather than being against the black movement and being enemies of the black movement, that they should be in favor of the black movement and supporters of the black movement, because the things that the black movement is doing inside of industry are basically in their interests. The kinds of demands and the kinds of movements, which black people are making inside of the plants are not inimical to the interests of the average white worker.
Yeah, so that was the voice of Ken Cockrell. And I wrote the super chat down, by the way. Thank you very much. And we'll address that. But that was the voice of Ken Cockrell, and Ken Cockrell was an African American attorney who was a communist, and he was in Detroit, and he represented a number of cases. And one of the cases he represented that was very famous was okay. All right, wrote it down. One of the cases that he represented was the case of Jimmy Johnson. It was a case of Jimmy Johnson. It was an African American auto worker who had been kind of harassed on the job. It was a majority white plant, and he was a black auto worker, and he was kind of being bullied and harassed by the other workers on the job. And what happened was that he took some vacation time, and he came back, and they said, "Where were you?" And he said, "Well, I filed for my vacation." And they said, "Oh, we lost your form." And he was fired. And he was wrongfully fired from his job. Even he had filled out the forms to have his break, but they fired him basically. And he perceived it as being fired, being racist. So the next day he came to work with a gun, and he shot one of his coworkers, and he shot one of the white workers at his job. He was obviously charged with murder, and Ken Cockrell represented him, and he was acquitted. Jimmy Johnson was actually acquitted because they argued that basically he was reacting to racism in the plant, and that this was a justifiable thing. And this black jury in Detroit acquitted Jimmy Johnson. It was a big deal at the time. And then there was another case where the Black Panthers, in Detroit, they were going around executing heroin dealers because heroin was a scourge on the black community. And while, white hippies might have thought drugs were cool and they wanted to get stoned, man, or whatever, the Black Panthers, they saw heroin as just a scourge on their community. So a group of Black Panthers went to go kill some heroin dealers. What they didn't know is these heroin dealers had an arrangement with the Detroit Police Department. So when they started shooting, the shootout started between the Black Panthers and the heroin dealers. At that point, the police came in to support the heroin dealers, and there was a big shootout, and a couple police got killed. And so these Black Panthers were all put on trial, and Ken Cockrell got them acquitted as well. And it showed that among the public in Detroit at that point in the early 70s, among the black community, the black working class in Detroit, there was a really revolutionary atmosphere. But what Ken Cockrell is talking about in that video is that among white workers, that wasn't the case. And that, the white working class largely didn't want to hear what these revolutionaries had to say. And that was kind of the tragedy of the new communist movement in the 1970s. It started out, basically, you had the Black Panthers, which was this black revolutionary, black nationalist organization. And the Black Panthers, a lot of the people that were involved in Students for a Democratic Society, which was this mass student youth activist group, a lot of the people involved in Students for a Democratic Society supported the Black Panthers. So the Black Panthers basically told Students for a Democratic Society, go organize white people. All right, we organize the black people, go organize the white people. And eventually we'll form some kind of united front. And we're going to have a Chicano organization, the Brown Berets, and we're going to have an Asian organization called, Iwar Kun. And we're going to have an organization of Puerto Ricans called the Young Lords. And eventually they're going to merge into one revolutionary party. So So the white people in SDS, they were divided. There was one faction that was like an ultra-left adventurist faction. Those are the folks that we know as the Weathermen. And they went and did like a crazy bombing campaign, and a bunch of them, they did a bunch of bombings and stuff like that. But the Black Panthers denounced that. And that's actually very interesting. Fred Hampton, when the Weathermen had their big, Days of Rage in Chicago, it was called, this big, violent demonstration. Fred Hampton denounced it, and he called it Custeristic. He compared it to General Custer in the cowboy movies, right? And how basically they were setting themselves up to be murdered, and it was dangerous. And the Black Panthers advised their supporters to go and organize the white community. And so there was Students for a Democratic Society had divided into two, and the faction that was supporting the Black Panthers was called the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And the Weathermen, they were Revolutionary Youth Movement 1. But it's Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 that became the basis for the new communist movement in the United States. And almost immediately, it broke up into rival factions. And probably the one that's the most famous that you still know about, they're in the United States now. It was called the Revolutionary Union, or the RU. Now it's known as the Revolutionary Communist Party. It's Bob Avakian of the Bay Area. His father was a judge in Berkeley, and he was from kind of a wealthy family, and he was a white guy who'd raised money for the Black Panthers, and it was the Revolutionary Union. The way that they really got started was that Bob Avakian took out ads in newspapers all around the country, urging radical students to come and support an oil workers strike in Richmond County, California. A group of oil workers were on strike, I think it was 1969. And Avakian knew that there were a lot of young, kind of young hippie college kids who were interested in communism. So he took out this ad in like the Guardian newspaper and a lot of different newspapers in the United States, radical newspapers, urging young people to come to Richmond and support the oil workers. And they did. And there were a couple hundred, young activists from around the country who went to Richmond County, California, and walked the picket lines and supported the oil workers. And that was kind of the beginning of the Revolutionary Union. Well, the RU was Bob Avakian's attempt to do that. There was a guy named Mike Klonsky, and Mike Klonsky's father had been a big leader of the Communist Party USA. And Mike Klonsky, he started a group called the October League, which eventually became the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. That was another faction. There was a group of Asian Americans they were called the Asian Study Group, and they were led by a guy named Jerry Tung. And eventually they formed the Communist Workers' Party, the CWP. And what's particularly fascinating about the CWP is that, they didn't last very long. It was a 1970s formation. But the Communist Workers' Party, a lot of the people who were in it are now very prominent in American politics. There's a woman on the New York City Council, Margaret Chin, and she was the leader of the Communist Workers' Party of New York City. The mayor of Oakland, California, for a long time was a woman named Jean Quan, an Asian American woman named Jean Quan. She was also a leader of the Communist Workers' Party. In New York City, in Flushing, Queens, and in Chinatown, there are a lot of like nonprofits that are Asian American nonprofits. They're all run pretty much by former members of the Communist Workers' Party. It's really fascinating. Most of them now are not communists at all. Like Margaret Chin in the New York City Council, she supports Israel, and she's just, no one even brings up that she used to be a communist because she's the most mainstream Democrat you ever heard of. But if you, could look at her Wikipedia page, it is a fact that, in the 1970s, she was the leader of the Communist Workers' Party in New York City. And again, it kind of makes sense because at that time in the 1970s, among like an ethnic minority community, if you were politically active, right? If you were black, you were with the Black Panthers. If you were Puerto Rican, you'd be with the Young Lords. And so it would make sense that among Asian Americans, that the politically active young Asian Americans would be communists. That made perfect sense, actually. One of the most famous incidents with the Communist Workers' Party was in 1979. They were massacred by the Ku Klux Klan. 5 of them were shot down in Greensboro, North Carolina. And we're going to get to that later. That's like towards the end of what I'm talking about. But I'm just trying to give you an impression of what these different groups were doing. And, you had, the new communist movement was mostly white people. Now, you had exceptions, like in Detroit, you had the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which became the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And you had the Communist Workers' Party, which was largely an Asian American organization, but it was mostly white people. And it was wealthier white people who'd gone to Harvard, white people who'd gone to Yale, wealthier backgrounds. And they would get jobs in factories. And they would get jobs in factories, and they would try to win their coworkers to communism. And it didn't go so well because a lot of their coworkers were comfortable, and they were trying to figure out, how do we build a communist movement, at a moment where it seems like the working class doesn't want to hear it. And at the same time, China's politics were starting to change, and that created a lot of controversy because China was starting to align with the United States in foreign policy. After the fall of Lin Biao, Lin Biao was like, Mao's right-hand man at one point and was considered the father of the Cultural Revolution. Lin Biao died, or he like tried to kill Mao and got on a plane and the plane crashed, or it's not clear what happened, but Lin Biao betrayed Mao. And so after the fall of Lin Biao, you had the rise of the Gang of Four during the Cultural Revolution. And with the rise of the Gang of Four, you saw, the Soviet Union being referred to not just as revisionist, but as social imperialist. And you started seeing China aligning with the United States in terms of foreign policy. And that got very confusing because a lot of these communists, their entire basis of being communists had been protesting against the Vietnam War, protesting against the United States. So when China was aligning with the United States, it got very confusing. And, there was the coup in Chile. 1973, the CIA overthrew the Chilean government and installed Augusto Pinochet as the dictator of Chile, right? And there were protests against it in the United States, right? Against this fascist coup in Chile. But China recognized Pinochet and was friendly to Pinochet. And that was very confusing for a lot of these communists, right? In the United States, for example, there was a lot of protests among Iranian Americans against the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was considered a puppet of U.S. imperialism, but China was very friendly with the Shah of Iran. And so it got to be very, very confusing. And that's when you have the rise of what China called their three worlds theory, which was the idea that the Soviet Union and the United States, they were the first world, and then there was Europe, which was the second world, and then there was the rest of the world, with the developing world, the global South, that was the third world. And the idea was that China was leading the third world against the first world, basically, the three worlds theory. And that was very, very confusing for a lot of these communists because their entire orientation had been opposing U.S. imperialism. And then China was saying, at one point, China actually said that the Soviet Union was the main danger to the people of the world. And that was so confusing to them. And so it was very confusing. And many people have pointed out that the new communist movement, all of these groups wanted to get like China to officially recognize them as the official Chinese recognized Communist Party, right? CPUSA, the Communist Party USA, was recognized as the official Communist Party of the United States by the Soviet Union. And all of these groups were kind of competing with each other, trying to outdo each other in getting China's approval. And they would do very silly things to do it. For example, one of the things that they had in the Cultural Revolution in China was they had a campaign after Lin Biao allegedly betrayed Mao. They had a campaign called Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius, right? Because Confucius was, the founder of Chinese civilization. And Lin Biao had been this leader of the Chinese Communist Party who'd been, betrayed Mao or whatever. So they had criticized Lin Biao, criticized Confucius. So the Chinese government was putting out a lot of documents criticizing Confucianism. And so, like some of these groups were so desperate to get China's approval, and they were desperate for China to like them better than the other communist groups, that they would have protests against Confucius in the United States. And the story goes, they would burn Confucius books. And that I believe it was in Seattle, there was a group of Maoists from the October League, and they had a rally against Confucius, and they burned books of Confucius, and they had a rally down with Confucius, because they were trying to show that they were in line with what Beijing wanted. And it was kind of silly in some ways, but the main problem ultimately was that they were getting jobs in factories. They were trying to win their coworkers to communism, and their coworkers didn't want to hear it. Now, in 1976, that was the bicentennial, right? It was, 1776 was the American Revolution. 1976 was the 200-year anniversary of the American Revolution, of the American Declaration of Independence. So there were different protests against it. And the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they had a rally against it called "We've Carried the Rich for 200 Years. Now let's dump them off our backs." And that was the campaign that they had. And they put posters up all across the United States. "We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs." They had a couple of Vietnam veterans who went to the Statue of Liberty and unfurled a big banner that said, "We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs." And they unfurled this big banner. And they just got that slogan out everywhere. I mean, it was on bumper stickers. Any major city in the United States, you were going to see stickers everywhere. It said, "We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs." And the Revolutionary Communist Party, they had a rally of about 5,000 people who came to Philadelphia for that rally, for that slogan, "We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs." And there's a very famous photograph from that demonstration because they had a lot of Vietnam veterans who were part of the Revolutionary Union or the Revolutionary Communist Party. And they had the veterans in the march in uniform. They wore their military uniforms, and they marched in the parade, in the demonstration, and with a banner that said, "We won't fight another rich man's war." And you've probably seen that photograph. It's very famous. There's a photograph, and it says, "We won't fight another rich man's war." And it's like a crowd of Vietnam veterans. And that was the Revolutionary Communist Party. That was their march. And they pretty much controlled the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization, the VVAW, it was called. And what's funny is that John Kerry, who was Secretary of State under Obama and was the presidential candidate in the United States in 2004, he was in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War for the first year that it was started. So a lot of the people that he worked with when he started Vietnam Veterans Against the War were actually Maoist communists. And the right wing brought that up at various points. If you read like right wing emails, David Horowitz, they would bring this up that, yeah, it's true that John Kerry, when he was protesting the Vietnam War after he got back from Vietnam, he was hanging out with a lot of Maoist communists. So a lot of the Bobavakian people were hanging out with John Kerry, which I think is a fascinating historical detail. The Revolutionary Communist Party, they did their "We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now we'll dump them off our backs." A number of other communist groups had a rally called Bicentennial Without Colonies. And they had a rally to protest the bicentennial celebrations in Philadelphia. And it was a confusing time because, again, they were doing everything that you're supposed to do. They formed unemployed organizations to fight for the rights of the unemployed. They tried to form their own factions within the labor movement. In some places that was successful, like Detroit, but for the most part, you didn't have that. But at the same time, average working class people didn't seem to want to hear it because the economy was doing so well. So you had weird things. Like I've talked about the busing incident. So, in 1974, you had these racist anti-busing riots in Boston where white workers, they were going to try to integrate schools was the idea. Instead of having black schools in the black neighborhood, schools in the white neighborhood, they were busing kids to different schools to have equal education. And you had a lot of racist white workers who were like protesting against busing. There was like racial attacks on black children, and it was a awful, like, kind of racist movement. And you had the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, they supported it on the grounds that it was working class people doing it, and that the answer to racism was communism, not school busing, so therefore it was correct. And they found a way to kind of support this right-wing movement. And then you had like the October League, they were supporting black nationalists who opposed busing, because a lot of like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam and groups like that, they didn't support busing because they wanted black children in black schools. They were racial separatists. And so you had the October League supporting them. And the Workers' World Party, they had the big demonstration, Say No to Racism, in 1974. It was a big deal because they mobilized this big demonstration to counter the racist anti-busing, riots. And around the same time, you had in West Virginia, you had the textbook riots. The textbooks in West Virginia and like the mountains and the Appalachian communities, school textbooks were teaching Darwinian evolution. And you had, evangelical fundamentalists who went out and rioted and bombed buildings and were angry about their textbooks teaching evolution and teaching Darwinian evolution. And the Revolutionary Communist Party supported that because they said, oh, these are working class people and this is their sovereignty, right? They want the right to decide what their kids learn in school. It was clearly like a right-wing creationist anti-science kind of thing, but they supported it on those grounds. It was a very strange moment. And the reason that they were kind of doing this was because, again, they were looking for any moment where working class people would be in motion. Any moment where working class people would be in motion, because there was such a big, soft, comfortable middle class. That labor aristocracy that Lenin writes about was so strong that any moment where working class people would be in a fighting mode, they would run to them. And that's the concept of the aristocracy of labor. And I want to talk about that because there's a lot of confusion about that, right? So if you read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, if you read Imperialism and the Split in Socialism by Lenin, Lenin basically explains that, okay, so imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage. It's when the big corporations and banks in the United States and Britain and in France and Germany and the Western countries, they dominate the world economy. They dominate the world and they hold back economic development around the world. It's called the export of capital. Instead of countries exporting products, the businesses are exported. That's like you have McDonald's all over the world, right? Because they don't export just French fries, they export McDonald's, right? You have American oil companies all over the world. You have American manufacturing companies all over the world. The export of capital, the domination of the world economy by multinationals, cartels, trusts, and syndicates based in the Western countries. This is imperialism. And Lenin said that imperialism was capitalism in its monopoly stage. And the main aspect of imperialism is that it holds back economic development. In India, the British Empire went to India and they burned all the textile looms. And they forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain. That's imperialism. Gandhi, what was Gandhi arrested for? If you know the story of Gandhi, he was arrested for boiling seawater to make salt, right? If you look at the history. And why was that a crime? Because the British, they didn't want India to have its own salt companies. So they made a law that you couldn't do that. That if you were in India, you had to buy your salt from a British, salt company. So as an act of protest, the people of India and Gandhi, they boiled salt water and made their own salt as they defied this unjust law. And that's how the British were dominating the economy of India, keeping India underdeveloped, burned down the textile looms. A much more recent example is Mexican farmers. Bill Clinton passed NAFTA. And with NAFTA, American agribusiness destroyed the farming sector of Mexico. The people of Mexico have been growing their own food for thousands and thousands of years, long before Christopher Columbus ever showed up in Mexico. Long before the Spaniards showed up in Mexico, the people of Mexico have been growing their own food. But Bill Clinton passed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and NAFTA forced the Mexican government to lift any regulations of the import of American agricultural products. So American businesses went in there and they sold, corn and bacon and eggs and cheese and agricultural products, at much lower costs. They put all the Mexican farmers out of business. And now Mexico, a country where people have been growing their own food for thousands of years, imports most of its food to the United States. That's the export of capital. American agribusiness companies have taken over Mexico. This is imperialism. This is the nature of imperialism. Imperialism is about holding back development. It's about keeping the world poor. And this is what people need to understand. The way imperialism is discussed by liberal academia, they make it sound like it's about culture. They make it sound like it's about arrogance and chauvinism. Imperialism is an economic system that is about holding back development in the colonized world. It's about keeping Africa and South America and Asia poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. That's what imperialism is. Imperialism is an economic system. And all over the world, you can see examples of this. Prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Iraq was a country with its own state-run oil company that was selling oil on the international markets in competition with ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell. Well, now Iraq has been blown to bits, and it only exports about 11% of the amount of oil that it exported when Saddam Hussein was in power. Libya used to be the top oil exporting country in Africa, but now Libya has been blown to bits, and it exports about like 10%, maybe 8 or 9% of the oil that it exported under the time of Gaddafi. There is the top oil exporting country in Africa today is Nigeria, and Nigeria. No African country exports more oil than Nigeria does, right? They are the top oil exporting country in Africa. However, the life expectancy in Nigeria is not very high, and the rate of literacy in Nigeria is not very high. And there's malnutrition all through Nigeria, and people there are hungry and starving. And why is that? It's because the oil that Nigeria exports isn't run by Nigerians. It's run by ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. The export of capital. American corporations and British corporations control their oil markets. And the oil of Nigeria doesn't make Nigerians rich. It makes Wall Street bankers rich. That's imperialism. Imperialism is holding back economic development. And you're not going to learn this in college. In college, they're going to give you this cultural wank about, being insensitive, and they're missing the point. Imperialism is an economic system. So this is a really, really important thing. Now, the labor aristocracy, this is what Lenin explained, which is that because these big banks and corporations and trusts and syndicates and big monopolies, these ultra monopolies, exist in the capitalist Western countries. Those corporations, they're not just making profits, right? That's what every capitalist makes, profits. But these corporations are making super profits, right? Because they're raking in wealth from across the world. And the workers in the colonized world, they're not just exploited, but because their countries are kept in chronic poverty, they're super exploited. So you have super profits for the imperialist monopolies, and you have super exploitation of the people in the colonized world. However, in the homeland, imperialism enables the capitalist class to stratify the working class and start paying some workers higher wages than others. And when a certain strata of the working class see their living standard go up, this changes their consciousness, and they begin to sympathize with the bosses against the other workers. And Lenin wrote about this, right? The aristocracy of labor. And in the United States, in Lenin's time, the main way this was done in the United States and in Britain was they would play what they called skilled workers against unskilled or industrial workers, right? The construction workers and the pipe fitters and the bricklayers, they had guilds, and you had to have an apprenticeship to be one of those. You couldn't just do it. So they were considered skilled workers, and their pay was way higher than people who worked in an auto plant or a meat packing facility or a steel mill, and or a garment factory. And that these quote unquote skilled workers who were in the trades, they had this attitude that they didn't want unskilled workers that worked in meatpacking facilities or worked in garment factories, or they didn't want them to have unions because they were not skilled. And it was the skilled workers, the craftsmen, right, against the unskilled workers. And there was a racial dynamic. The craftsmen, the guild workers, they tended to, the skilled workers, they tended to be, they tended to be white, and they tended to be Protestant, and, they tended to be Anglo, right? Scottish, English, whatever. Whereas the unskilled workers at that time tended to be Italian or Irish, or Eastern European, and in some cases black. They'd be black workers from the South who'd come up to the North looking for a better job. And so dividing the skilled and the unskilled was the main way, like before the Second World War, that the labor aristocracy was defined, right? And that the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was considered the union of the labor aristocracy. It didn't allow black workers. Most of the unions that made up the AFL had a rule: no black people, no one who wasn't born in the United States. It was exclusive. And it was racist, and it supported the U.S. government in their wars. And it was a union. It was workers, but because they had privilege, right? Because they were getting higher wages, they identified with the capitalist bosses and the imperialists against the lower paid workers. That's the aristocracy of labor. And Lenin wrote about how World War I happened because of the aristocracy of labor. That the socialist groups in Europe, the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party, the German Social Democratic Party, they became dominated by the aristocracy of labor. These higher paid workers with their craft unions, they came to dominate the socialist groups in Europe. And so when World War I came, they supported it because in their minds, they identified with their bosses. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm absolutely getting to that, Chaya. You're right on point. Well, after the Second World War, after World War II, you had, the boom of the 1950s, the post-World War II economic boom, and the United States was the only Western industrial country that was not destroyed in World War II, right? Britain, all the major cities of Britain were bombed to shit by the Nazis. All the major cities in France had been destroyed by fighting. All the major cities in Germany, all the major cities in Japan. So, because of that, the United States still had its economy rolling. All the factories in the United States were still up. The United States had not been bombed to shit. So after the Second World War, the United States suddenly was at the center of the world economy. And as they were rebuilding from World War II, everyone was buying their cars and their steel and their electrical products and everything from the United States. So the United States had this huge economic boom. So the aristocracy of labor in the United States expanded. And you had the strike wave of 1947, where, there were strikes. The auto workers went on strike and the steel workers went on strike. And you had the Oakland general strike where the unions shut down Oakland, California. And the wages of American industrial workers in the aftermath of the Second World War shot up. I mean, auto workers were suddenly making way more than they'd ever made before, and steel workers were making way more than they'd ever made before, and garment workers even, and there was a rise in the wages of industrial workers in the United States. That's where you get the suburbs, right? And that that white picket fence and Leave It to Beaver and the American Dream. But this was pretty much only for white people, right? And they talk about this. Banks wouldn't loan money to black people to have a house in the suburbs. These neighborhoods were racially segregated. But for white industrial workers, they basically became part of the aristocracy of labor. All right. And that affected their consciousness. And it was in the context of this expansion of the aristocracy of labor that McCarthyism smashed the U.S. Communist Party. The U.S. Communist Party was wiped out. And a lot of people who would have supported the Communist Party thought, hey, my wages just went up. I just got a nice new fancy house in the suburbs. I'm making way more money than I ever thought. Why would I care about the Communist Party? And this fancy new invention called the television that we all have just told me that Stalin wants to drop an atomic bomb on all of us. And so in this atmosphere where the living standard was going up, the living standards were going up. There was a surge of right-wing patriotism among American workers coming out of the Second World War. And the U.S. government used that opportunity to smash the Communist Party. And that was very much kind of defining the United States during the 50s. And the post-World War II years, the labor aristocracy expanded. It vastly expanded. And the consciousness of American workers went down. In the 1930s, average workers were much more class conscious. You had big strikes and big labor union protests, and Roosevelt had been kind of a populist who'd aligned himself with the Communist Party, but that was all erased in the 1950s because of the aristocracy of labor. And in the 1970s, the aristocracy of labor was still very much alive in the auto plants and in the steel mills and in a lot of places in the United States. The labor aristocracy, this layer of well-paid, middle-class industrial workers who were technically workers, but they had such a comfortable existence that they identified with their bosses, that was still intact. And because of that, the consciousness of American workers was declining. And there was a lot of racism among these white workers, and that's why they had the busing riots, and that's why you had a lot of right wing, fascistic, bigoted, pro U.S. imperialism sentiments among American industrial workers. And so the new communist movement was not very successful. Well, if you fast forward to the end of the decade, 1978, 1979, you had a big economic downturn. And these communists had been in the factories for so many years, right? And their coworkers didn't want to hear it. So 1978, 1979, the economy goes down. And you had a moment where a lot of these communist groups said, okay, it's now or never. Now or never. And they started doing crazy things. And like one of the things was that, the Greensboro massacre of 1979. So the Communist Workers' Party, this Maoist communist group, they were working in textile factories. They all got jobs in, not all of them, but some of them had gotten jobs in the textile factories in Greensboro, North Carolina. And they were auto workers, or they were textile workers in Greensboro, North Carolina. And at that time, the Ku Klux Klan, this was the South, and it was the 1970s in the South, the Ku Klux Klan was a group. And so they had the idea that they were going to fight the Ku Klux Klan. So they sent a letter to the Ku Klux Klan challenging them to a fight. And they sent this letter to the KKK, and they said, we're going to have a rally on this date. It's going to be called Death to the Klan. And we challenge you to show your face at this rally. You're cowards, you're bigots, you're enemies of the working class, whatever. And so then they got a permit, and they had a march called Death to the Klan. And they had a big banner that said Death to the Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan showed up and shot 5 of them. And there was a TV crew that filmed the whole thing. And the Ku Klux Klan gunned down these workers and shot 5 communists on live television. And then the Klansmen were acquitted in court. And we now know that a few of the Ku Klux Klan members who killed members of the Communist Workers' Party were FBI informants or members of the Bureau of Alcohol and Firearms and Tobacco. And that the local police had given the parade route of the protest to the Ku Klux Klan, etc. And it was basically an assassination. The U.S. government had kind of teamed up with the Klan to assassinate these 5 communists. And you can read about the Greensboro massacre. It was a horrendous event, and it kind of shook the country. It made headlines all over the country that there had been, this massacre, that the KKK had opened fire and killed 5 communists. And some people might argue that there was a little bit of adventurism on the part of the Communist Workers' Party, right? They didn't have to send them a letter and challenge them to a fight. And if they did, shouldn't they have come with guns on their own to protect themselves? But regardless, they didn't deserve to die. This was cold-blooded murder. And the Communist Workers' Party, they had 5 of their members gunned down. It was a horrendous incident. And then later, when the Klansmen were acquitted in court, they wanted Jimmy Carter, the president, to bring federal charges against the Klan. And he wouldn't bring federal charges against them. So they went to the Democratic National Convention that was held, right? The DNC, when Jimmy Carter was running for re-election in 1980. And in the convention hall, they set off fireworks. I can't even imagine this, but you can read some of these newspaper articles. They were actually in the convention hall, and their members set off fireworks, and acted crazy, and a number of them were arrested, and hundreds of members of the Communist Workers' Party were arrested. It was very crazy. It was a very crazy time. But these groups figured that this was their moment, right? The economy was finally downturning. But what was happening was that white workers in the United States were becoming more conservative. You had the rise of the Reagan Revolution because their living standards had been going up so much, right? Since the 1950s, their living standard had been going up. It was going up in the 60s. This was the first major downturn in the economy since the end of the Second World War. So they weren't going to immediately become communists. They were going to go back to what worked before. You had a rise of right-wing conservatism, the Reagan Revolution. So some other groups did some crazy things during that time period. The RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, they decided that Deng Xiaoping was not a true communist, that he had sold out the Chinese Revolution. So in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping had, his visit to the White House, they had a big protest at the White House, death to Deng Xiaoping. And they protested against Deng Xiaoping. And it was like a very violent, crazy demonstration that they had against Deng Xiaoping at the White House. It was a lot of these groups doing crazy things. But ultimately, after about 1980, 1981, 1982, you have what I call the Great Retreat, which is they all basically decided that because they had spent a decade from like 1970 to 1980, they'd spent a decade trying to convince American white workers, average white American workers, to become communists. They decided it couldn't be done. Couldn't be done. That American workers were just too conservative and too right wing. And all the communist groups did something else. They all decided, well, we can't win average Americans to become anti-imperialist and socialist. We can't do it. So they all decided to do something else. They became college professors and set up on the campus. Some of them went into the trade union bureaucracy. Some of them went and campaigned for the Democrats and maneuvered within the Democratic Party. They all found something else to do. And some of them, dedicated themselves to the black struggle, right? A lot of the Maoist groups, they were protesting for police brutality long before it was trendy because they figured, well, the only place that there was revolutionary, the only place that there was revolutionary potential among the working class in the United States was among the black working class, and so they argued that they would make that their focus, but they all kind of decided it can't be done, and that's the problem that we're in. That's the problem that we're in right now, is because we're in a period where all these communist groups in the United States, all of them are led by people who decided that it can't be done. You can't win average Americans to be communists. You just can't do it. And they're wrong. They are absolutely wrong. Millions of working class people in the United States have seen their living standards go down. The factories have closed down. Neighborhoods throughout the United States are crumbling. You can see empty foreclosed homes. The water is not being properly purified. The power plants are falling apart. The power grid in Texas collapsed last year during the winter and left all kinds of working families. Working class Americans are more open to a socialist message than ever before. Ever before. That labor aristocracy that kind of made the new communist movement impossible has been eroded. Living standards have gone down. They have gone down. And with living standards going down, there is now more potential to win average American workers, white, black, Arab, Asian, Latino, to a revolutionary class struggle message, right? And wherever you go in the United States, people feel that the government is run by a group of rich people who don't care about them. People feel that our freedoms are being taken away and our civil liberties are under attack and the police state is out of control. However, the ruling class right now is trying to whipsaw Americans. They're trying to play the people in the red states against the people in the blue states. They're trying to play, urban middle class white people and ethnic minorities against rural and southern white people. And it's not going to work, right? I mean, ultimately, it's going to work, but it's working to weaken the entire working class. And right now, we need to break with the Great Retreat. That's largely what the Center for Political Innovation is about. We need to get back to the idea that working people can fight and win economic reforms. And we need to get back to the idea that average working class Americans, the broad masses of Americans of all nationalities, all backgrounds, all religions, all cultures, can be brought together around a class struggle program to win a decent life. And, I actually wanted to show this clip from, we just had this amazing conference at the Center for Political Innovation in Austin, Texas. It was really great. It was a really great conference. And I've boasted about it on here before, and you guys have heard about me. But I want to show a clip that I posted today from David Cedillo. David Cedillo is a young man who lives in San Angelo, Texas. And in his working class community in San Angelo, he has built a working class Marxist group called San Angelo Solidarity that's affiliated with the Center for Political Innovation. And he gave this amazing talk, and we just sent him to Nicaragua on a delegation with Lily Goldklang and him. They went to Nicaragua to see what the Sandinistas have achieved and how they've joined the Belt and Road Initiative with China. And David Cedillo, he gave a great presentation about Nicaragua, but he ended it by saying that what we need to do in the United States is he urged everyone to build a working class socialist community of solidarity in their neighborhood, in their community. And because you can do it, the idea that you can't do it is wrong. This is what he said. I just want to play the clip from his speech.
Solidarity, to build your own community of truth. I know for a fact every single one of you could do it. If y'all guys didn't care about any of this or care about making a better world, you wouldn't be here. You'd be on your butt, watching TV, drinking beers with your friends. But no, you want to make a difference in the world. You want to make the world a better place, like I do. And I know every single one of you in this room has it in you to organize and to get these messages out there to the populace and get to real working people with real material change. Because I can say this, before I was able to have my own community of solidarity through the CPI and San Angelo Solidarity, I felt alone. I felt hopeless. I felt like I live in a bad place. Why should I even try? That's BS. That's throwing in the towel. We actually need to get out there and try and make this world a better place, because it is shifting. America is losing its global position, and it's all about who will pick up the pieces. Will it be people like us, or will it be insane far-right demagogues? And I sure as hell don't want to see that future. I'd rather fight alongside all of you to make a more peaceful and equitable world for everybody in this planet. And I think that we can all do that. As long as we dare to struggle, we're gonna dare to win. Dare to struggle? Dare to struggle? Dare to win! Dare to struggle? Dare to win!
Yeah, it was just a great moment when David got up there and talked about the importance of building communities of solidarity. And we can actually organize the working class. We can do it. And the synthetic left isn't going to do it. They want to focus on identity politics. They think average Americans are the problem. At the beginning of this presentation, I played a clip from the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit, and they talked about how even then, when that labor aristocracy was very big, their approach to white workers was that supporting the Black freedom movement was in their interest. They were not trying to make life worse for white workers. They were trying to build a working class united front to bring the entire working class together, and that is different than the IDPOL approach. And that the woke left, that is rallying for Ukraine right now, and wants the USA to launch World War III by putting a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the woke left, that is basically that says that if you support China, or if you don't believe the propaganda about Uyghurs, that you're the same as a Nazi. They are not the future. And they have basically declared that average American workers are the enemy. And average American workers are not the enemy. Average American workers are seeing their living standards go down, especially among our generation, the youth. We're never going to have the standard of living that our parents had. The economy is in decline, and now is the time that we can build real solidarity. We can get average American working class people to understand that the same enemy that is trying to crush the People's Republic of China is also the enemy of people in Chicago and in Detroit and in Pittsburgh. We can get them to understand that the same U.S. ruling class that is moving against Venezuela and putting sanctions on Venezuela is also the people that are driving our wages down and gutting the infrastructure of this country and spending all the money that should be going to building a decent education system on wars. We can do it, right? And we can get American workers to understand that what we need is a government of action that will fight for working families. A government that, instead of just sitting back and letting the economy crumble as these big corporations make super profits, instead stands up for average Americans. I like to tell people that, if you're a parent in the United States and your child doesn't have proper clothing in the winter and they're cold, or they're not eating properly, you can go to jail. And you're not going to go to jail for what you did, You're going to go to jail for what you didn't do, right? Because that's called criminal neglect. And right now, the government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect. This is supposed to be the richest country in the world, but we're going to have food shortages. Joe Biden just announced today. We're going to have food shortages. The power plants are falling apart. The infrastructure is in shambles. The roads are crumbling. This is a nightmare. Living standards are going down. People are killing themselves with opioids. People are killing themselves with drugs. People are literally killing themselves. The suicide rate is through the roof. And right now, the government of the United States is in complete dereliction of duty. And a socialist government, a government of action, could fight for the working class. It could stand up and say that instead of building prisons, instead of building more of a military industrial complex, we can start investing in our people, and we can make friends with China. We can make friends with Russia. We can make friends with Iran, and we can start doing business with countries around the world on the basis of win-win cooperation. And a government of action that would fight for working families would dismantle imperialism. It would bring people together, different races, different nationalities, different religious groups. It would bring them together. It wouldn't be driving Americans further apart in some crazy culture war. That's what we need, is a government of action that will fight for working families. And the Center for Political Innovation is based on this understanding that it is time to get out of the movement and to the masses. We need to break with the woke left, with the bread tube, synthetic left, ID poll, that toxic politics that thinks average Americans are Nazis, and we need to break with it. And instead, we need an optimistic, constructive socialism. And we need to be patriotic. We need to say that if you really love America, you have to hate imperialism. Because this global imperialist system, the rule of the world by monopolistic corporations and banks, is not good for America. It is driving our living standards down. And these wars are not good for America. And spending money on bombing countries around the world while our communities are crumbling is not good for America. And to truly love America, you should be a socialist. That should be our message. And furthermore, we should be clear that, if you are a religious person, and you want justice, you should not believe in free market capitalism. No follower of Jesus Christ should believe in a system that puts profits over people. No follower of Jesus Christ should believe that we should have a government that should let Americans go to bed hungry, American children go to bed hungry in the richest country in the world with so much wealth, so much poverty amid abundance, right? We put out this book, Jesus is a Socialist. We've got quotes from the Bible. We've got quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., this book is intended to show people that this idea that to be a Christian, you have to reject Marxism and reject socialism is completely wrong. We have a section in here of quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I just want to read you. This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a couple quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is what he said. He said, "I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. And like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it is revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness." And, I want to talk, some of these quotes are utterly amazing. The one I really like here. What does he say? He says, "If America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all of God's children to have basic necessities of life, she will go to hell." That's Dr. Martin Luther King. And this is an amazing one. "These are revolutionary times." This is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1967. He said, "These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and we in the West must support these revolutions." We in the West must support these revolutions. Can you believe that? If Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were today, he would be supporting Venezuela. He'd be supporting Cuba. He'd be supporting Nicaragua. He'd be supporting Iran. He'd be admiring China and all the amazing things they've done to raise people out of poverty. And that's why we put this book out, and there are people in the Center for Political Innovation of all religious beliefs. I'd say about half the group are atheist or agnostic. I'm a Christian. There's other Christians in the group. There's Jews in the group. There's Muslims. There was a young man named Muhammad who gave a great speech at our panel at our event. I can't wait until Muhammad's speech. A young Pakistani young man, a Shia Muslim, got up and gave a kind of an amazing impromptu speech against Zionism and imperialism at our event. It was really powerful. And that needs to be the message. We need to start getting to average Americans with socialism, out of the movement to the masses. That needs to be our understanding. And that's the approach of the Center for Political Innovation. And we're growing every day. Every day I get another email notice that somebody else has joined the Center for Political Innovation. We just had our amazing conference in Texas. More people there than we thought, standing room only, no empty chairs. And the fallout from that conference, all over the country, people are talking about it. So we want to do it again. We're looking to figure out how to do our next conference. In Chicago, we're having a national gathering. I'd love to have him on. Sure, I'd have him on. We're having a national gathering this summer in June. It'll probably be in a rural area. It's going to be like a 4-day communist summer camp. We're doing it. We are building an organization of American working people to get them to understand that imperialism is their enemy. Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, these countries are their friends, not their enemies, and that the only way forward is for working people to stand up and demand a government of action that will fight for working families. Demand that the banks, factories, and industries be organized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. And let's be clear. Let's be very, very clear that in 21st century socialism, there is room for small business owners. In Nicaragua, the success of socialism has been their micro entrepreneurship program. In China, socialism with Chinese characteristics has created amazing mega corporations like Huawei Technologies that do amazing things. And that when you have the state controlling the means of production with 5-year economic plans, you can then allow the market sector to flourish to the benefit of all of society. Right now, our big corporations get rich as the country gets poorer. But in a socialist economy, in 21st century socialism, where you have a mixed economy, when the corporations don't control the government, but rather the government controls the corporations on behalf of the people, then you can have growth be unlimited. And that's the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal of communism is to create a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that inequality breaks down, that the need for coercion and government can break down, that we can have a society from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs, right? And that the goal is to raise productive forces. We don't want to make people poorer. We're not celebrating poverty. It's the opposite. We say that poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. And with socialist central planning, we can see a society where no one gets rich by making somebody else poor, but rather all can be raised up, and human creativity and abundance and brilliance can be unleashed to even higher levels. And we can go beyond the irrationality of a society where profits are in command. That's the idea, is to rationally organize the economy, unleash human growth and creativity so we can get to a whole new society. So, that does not mean we want to make everyone poor. That does not mean we want the government to forcibly seize every business and every business become a state-owned enterprise. No, we learned with the fall of the Soviet Union that you need there to be private corporations in socialism, but you need a government of action that will control them. And that's the understanding that they have in Venezuela, that they have in Cuba, that they have in Vietnam. This is 21st century socialism, and is that allowing the private sector to flourish with worker cooperatives, with micro entrepreneurship programs, but having an economy to serve the people. I can give you many examples, but then I guess we'd be here all night. So I just wanted to show yet another video, because people don't realize that there is nothing un-American about socialism. The first person to use the word socialism in the English language was Robert Owen, and Robert Owen built a socialist community in Indiana. And, Karl Marx wrote for the New York Tribune and praised Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in the Union Army named August Willich. And, Roosevelt met with communist labor activists like Gilbert Green at the White House, even let Gilbert Green sleep over at the White House. And there's nothing un-American about socialism. And at the end of the day, to truly love America, you should want socialism, and you should want friendship with the countries of the world that are breaking out of the global monopolistic imperialist system. And it's socialists that have led the struggle the great struggles throughout U.S. history for jobs, for education. We wouldn't have unemployment insurance if it weren't for communists. We wouldn't have a weekend or a minimum wage if it weren't for the communists. All these struggles, all these working class struggles that the synthetic left tells us are class reductionist. Oh, you're a class reductionist, right? We wouldn't have any of that. We wouldn't have any of the economic reforms we have in the United States, food stamps, if it weren't for socialists and communists who built the labor unions. And this has been erased. They worked really hard to erase this from our history. So I want to actually just show this video highlighting some of the forgotten history of class struggle in the United States. And then from there, we will do the roll call and I'll answer your questions. So there you go.
Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Brothers and sisters around the world, know that the time has come to fight the bosses until we win. Power for the working class. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. We are sick and tired of working like dogs to make some bloodsucker fat. When we take over with guns in our hands, they'll know they can't treat us like that. Power to the workers.
Efforts of business interests to forcibly open the strike-paralyzed port of San Francisco fail. Open warfare rages through the streets of the city as 3,000 Union pickets battle 700 police. Guns, tear gas, clubs, and fists bring injuries to more than 80 persons and cause the death of 2.
Workers got together, shot the city down. They marched on the fake red bosses hang out. And as they marched, the workers sang out. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Workers and peasants in Vietnam, drilling bosses, armies into the ground. Misleaders say let some businessmen stay, but armed workers' power gonna blow them away. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Power to the workers. Power to the working class. Racism must go. Power to the working class. Asian, Latin, black and white, all oppressed people must unite. Power to the workers. Power to the working.
All right. So there we go, folks. That was my opening presentation. I just thought I would show you a few clips tonight. So names and locations. Let's do the roll call. I'll call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, I'll start answering super chat questions for the rest of the show. That's how we'll do it. So names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Naples, Florida, Harold Sullivan, Rice, and Adelaide, Australia. Who else is with us? We got Micah in Las Vegas, Craig in Fort Lauderdale, Adam in Vegas, St. David's, Bermuda, Char Char Darling in Nassau County, Chaya in Montreal, Aloha State, Hawaii, David in China, Michael in Ithaca, Nick from Mayfield, Ohio, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Jared, Tristan in Maryland. Shout out to you, Tristan. We got Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn, Elizabeth in Virginia, Tucson, Arizona, San Francisco, Nathaniel from Washington, Dallas, Texas, Bob Troy in New York, San Antonio, Texas, Joe Gale in Nassau County, San Antonio, Texas, Laura Floyd. We got Nicola in Chicago suburbs. We got Jason Hunt in Chicago, Viking in Upper Peninsula, Virginia. We got Brenda, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, Giles in Cincinnati. We got Mr. Chopin in Kansas. We got Jose in Venezuela, Mohsen from Iran, New Jersey and Maryland, Leslie in Australia, Mr. Chopin in Kansas. We got someone in India, supposed to put up the Indian flag. Shout out to you in India. We got Leslie in Australia. Very good. Very, very good. Who else is with us tonight? We got someone in Kansas, Toronto. We got Michelle Gonzalez in Los Angeles. We got Jeff Metro in Detroit. We got Marlon in San Diego, Michelle Gonzalez in Los Angeles. Carolyn and Dario in Brooklyn. Shout out to you. Shout out to you, Carolyn and Dario. Very good. We got Richard from Woodland, California. Very good. Very, very good. Just reading them. Auckland, New Zealand, Stephen Clearly. Mark from California says, keep up the good work. Well, thank you, Mark. Rich, we got Dave in San Jose. We got Auckland, New Zealand, Indiana. Right. Very, very good. Someone else in Caracas is watching. We got someone else in New Zealand. We got Carlos in San Joaquin Valley. There we go. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff. Good stuff. Any other names and locations? Any other names and locations for me to call out today? Anybody else? Any other names and locations? Steve in Boston. Shout out to you, Steve. Glad you're watching. Steve in Boston. Steve in Boston. And we got, who else? We have got Sydney, Australia, Hanson Fisher, Chris in Salt Lake City. Very good. Very, very, very good. All good. Good stuff. Oakland, we got Kevin Silver in Oakland. We got someone in Ireland, La Grande, Oregon, Green Spacer. Marissa in Washington. Shout out to you, Marissa. Welcome to the program. Good to have you. It's Jeff in Metro Detroit. His name is not Jeff Metro. He's in Metro Detroit, but his name is Jeff. Very good. Sorry for the confusion there. We got someone in Mumbai, someone JD in Montreal, Ronald in Israel. We got Thailand, Atlanta, Georgia, Dabhab. Very good. Tri-Cities, Washington State. Amberly, shout out to you. We got who else do we have here? We've got, just waiting for them to pop in. They come in as like a group. It's like very good. Well, very good, everybody. Very, very good. All right. So now we're going to start doing the super chat. So if you have something you want me to talk about, shoot me a super chat. Shoot me a super chat. I'll throw Chaya's in here about divisions today among POC, labor, aristocracy. I'll put that in here. So the first question we got here is Left-Wing Communism by Lenin. And David Fox was asking me about how does that apply to the synthetic left today. Left-Wing Communism is a book that Lenin wrote, and he wrote it after the Soviet Union had been successful, after the Bolshevik Revolution, when they were setting up the Communist International. They were setting up the Communist International, and there were a lot of people around the world who were inspired by the Russian Revolution because it was a violent revolution. And they didn't really know anything about the tactics the Bolsheviks had used. They just kind of liked the idea that the Bolsheviks were this group of people who'd overthrown capitalism. They were revolutionaries. And so when Lenin formed the Communist International, he was trying to get them to understand how to be serious. And so he basically criticized ultra-leftism. And that's basically when people try to make themselves feel revolutionary. And in the process, they weaken the revolutionary movement. And he uses a number of examples. One example he uses is boycotting elections, right? You get a lot of these communists who say, well, the answer isn't voting, it's communist revolution. And Lenin points out that, voting, the elections in Western capitalist countries, for a lot of working class people, that's the only time they ever think about politics, right? That they're depoliticized, they're focusing on getting their kids to school and, getting through life. And so if you don't run candidates on a communist platform, you lose access to those workers. And so communists should participate in elections. They should run candidates. And it's necessary to run candidates. That's one thing he talks about. Another thing is he says, join non-communist unions. There were some of these workers in Britain and the United States and other places were saying, well, we don't want to join labor unions that aren't controlled by, I think you need to explain your feelings and opinions more often. I love you, man, but every answer can't be ancient history. Okay. I don't know what that means, but there you go. That they were saying, well, we don't want to join unions that aren't communist, right? These unions that are led by, reactionaries, that are tied to the Democrats, the Republicans, that have, conservative leadership. We're not going to join them. We're going to form a separate union that's revolutionary and communist. And Lenin says, no, you got to join the unions that exist and push for revolutionary politics inside of them. Right? If you just form this separate union that's more revolutionary, you lose access to all the workers that are in those unions. And Lenin also talked about how in Britain at the time, it was basically Russiagate, 1920s. The 1920s version of Russiagate was the Zinoviev letter, and is that they faked a letter. Lloyd George and the conservatives in Britain, they faked a letter to prove that the British Labour Party were agents of the Russians. And they weren't, right? The Labour Party was a right-wing, pro-imperialist, rotten, anti-communist, sellout party. But because the conservatives were fighting against them, the conservatives came up with this whole idea that the Russians, the Soviet Union, was funding and was paying for the Labour Party. It was a Russian conspiracy. Sound familiar? Well, anyway, at the time, the Labour Party was the party that all the labor unions were voting for in Britain. And so Lenin said, as bad as the Labour Party is, right now the conservatives are whipping up this crazy anti-communist campaign against the Labour Party, trying to say they're tied to the Soviet Union. So you need to endorse the Labour Party this time, not most of the time, but this time, in this moment, this atmosphere of crazy anti-communism, working class people see the Labour Party under attack. You need to endorse the Labour Party in the election. And of course, Sylvia Pankhurst and all these American communists or all these British communists said, that's crazy. We're never going to endorse the Labour Party. And Lenin said, don't worry. You'll be supporting the Labour Party in the same way that a noose supports a hanged man. That's what he said. Basically, by endorsing the Labour Party, the workers who are defending the Labour Party from the right wing will listen to you. And eventually they'll break with the reformism of the Labour Party and they'll become revolutionaries. So in order to gain access to those working class people that are defending the Labour Party from this hysterical anti-Russian campaign, it's necessary to vote for the Labour Party. That's what he was arguing, right? And that you'll be supporting it the same way a noose supports a hanged man. You're supporting the Labour Party to destroy the Labour Party, that it's tactical, right? And that's what he's saying, right? And the thing about left-wing communism, it's a great book, and it's very short. It's very easy to read. It's called like Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, a popular essay on tactics, I think, by Lenin. And what's so good about it is that a lot of the people who wave it around, like CPUSA, I think hasn't Vosh been waving it around, and some of these clowns, they need to actually read it. Because the point is that you join radical labor unions in order to win workers there to communism. And you run in elections in order to use the elections as a platform to win people to communism. And sometimes you endorse somebody like Bernie Sanders or a more reformist candidate so that you can win all of their supporters and all the people campaigning for them to communism. So the people who read it, they only do half. They only do half of it. They endorse the Democrats, which that's not what it says. It says to endorse socialists, not Democrats, but like the Labour Party were calling themselves socialists, social democrats. But you endorse moderate candidates and they don't win any of the candidates to communism. And they participate in elections, they vote, but they just vote for Democrats. And they support labor unions, but they don't push for communism within the labor unions. So a lot of the people who wave that book around, like the Communist Party USA, like DSA, they don't really know what it says, which is that you use these places as a place to spread the revolutionary anti-imperialist movement. And that's what they don't understand. If you actually read that book, it's very clear. The whole point of engaging in these tactics is to actually win. It's not a book that says be a Democrat. It's not a book that says be a reformist. Lenin's not saying that at all. He's saying don't be stupid. He says never build an unnecessary barrier between yourself and the working class. That's what he's saying. that if the workers are having are going to go vote in an election, you need to run a communist candidate in that election so that they hear the communist perspective. If the workers are in a reformist union, you ought to go into that union too and push for communist politics in that union. That's the point, right? If there's a candidate who's not really revolutionary, but is kind of the symbol of resistance, is a leader of the labor movement, or is pushing for progressive policies or against wars, it would be smart to endorse them so that you can win those workers that are kind of at odds with the system to communism. It's the people that go around promoting it don't understand it. They use it to say the opposite of what it means, right? You have ultra left groups in the United States that just want to scream communism and have no influence on anybody. And then you have sellout reformist groups like the DSA and the Communist Party USA. Daniel Estulin. Oh, we'll talk about him. We can definitely talk about him. All right. Those groups, they just do whatever the Democrats are doing, whatever the reformist labor unions are doing. There's two parts to it, and that's what people miss. All right. Next super chat question. Someone said Biden brings shame to this country, arming Nazis. Grandfather fought in World War II. I said it in the previous live, and I will say it again. How in the world can anyone say that what Russia is doing doesn't make sense now? All right. I mean, it's one thing to say that, like, if Russia, just randomly invaded Ukraine, that would obviously be wrong. Okay. But there have been 8 years of bombing and shelling of the people of Donetsk and Lugansk. And Russia has repeatedly said, implement the Minsk agreements, bring these people back into Ukraine. They have the Minsk agreement that was signed that Ukraine agreed to let the Russian-speaking people of the eastern regions become part of the Kiev government, become, the federated autonomy, respect their language rights, etc. But they haven't implemented it. And instead, they've been bombing and shelling Lugansk for 8 years, 14,000 plus people dead. And today, there was this guy, Carl Davidson, who's one of these clown, reformist leftists, was saying, well, the people in the eastern regions, they should negotiate with the government in Kiev. They did negotiate. 7 years ago, they signed a treaty. They did negotiate. And for 7 years, Russia's saying, you got the treaty signed, just let these people be part of Ukraine. And it wouldn't let them. So finally, when it became clear, last month that the United States was working with the Kiev government to just go in and slaughter these people, at that point, Russia moved in to protect them. But it gets even better. So not only were they slaughtering the Russian-speaking peoples of eastern Ukraine, of Donetsk, Lugansk, the Donbass regions for 8 years, and they've been killing them, not implementing the agreement. On top of that, the government in Ukraine has created an actual Nazi division of their army. And people say, well, it's not that big. It's only 100 people. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. If the U.S. government made the Ku Klux Klan an official wing of the U.S. Army, would it matter if there were 900 or 100 or 3 of them? You would get the message. Now, wouldn't you? If they made the Klan a wing of the American government, you would get the message, right? And by making the Azov Battalion a group that uses a Nazi symbol, that tears down World War II memorials, that admires a Nazi collaborator named Stepan Bandera and his participants in the Holocaust, a group that wants to murder Russians on an ethnic basis, by making them an official wing of the government, they are making a statement. So they made an official Nazi wing of the military. And then they announced they want to join the NATO coalition, so bring the NATO alliance right up to the border. And then the Ukrainian government said they want to get nuclear weapons. And now Russia knew before this happened, but didn't say anything. Now we know that there are biological weapons facilities. That there have been 30 biological weapons facilities set up in Ukraine. Now, all these people want to say to me, oh, they're not biological weapons facilities. And it's like, okay. Well, why is the Pentagon paying for them? Number one. Number two, why did Victoria Nuland talk about them? And Victoria Nuland was testifying, and Marco Rubio said to her, does Ukraine have biological weapons? And Victoria Nuland then said in response, they have labs. Why would she say that if they weren't? Why did she say that in response to their question? And now she's worried Russia's going to get its hands on them. Why does she worry about Russia getting their hands on them? If these labs are happy fun labs that that just do blood tests or something, then why is she so worried about Russia getting its hands on them? And why is the Pentagon paying for them? and involved in? Why is the Ukrainian military involved in them? Come on, folks. So the Ukrainian government was setting up biological weapons facilities, chemical and biological weapons facilities. They were talking about getting nuclear weapons. They were talking about joining the NATO alliance. They made an official Nazi wing of their military that wants to slaughter ethnic Russians. They've been killing people in the Russian-speaking regions for 8 years. And Russia's just supposed to go, oh, okay. All right, yeah, that's fine. Not our business. Would the United States be okay with in Mexico? If they were building biological weapons facilities, Russia was building them there. If they built a group of some kind of fascist Nazi fighting force that wanted to slaughter Americans. If they were talking about getting putting nukes in Mexico to threaten the United States, this is just what any country would do. Right? If your enemy country is right on your border, setting up biological weapons facilities, funding groups of Nazis, slaughtering people of your ethnic group, you're going to move in at some point. Russia is doing what any country would do under these circumstances. And I'm so sick of the way U.S. media doesn't tell you any of this. Russia is absolutely right to be doing what they're doing. I hope that Ukraine can just negotiate the end of this. If Ukraine would seriously negotiate, this would be over. And the most crazy thing about this is that U.S. leaders claim they care so much about Ukrainians. Oh, the poor Ukrainians. Bullshit. We now know, thanks to Yahoo News, that for the past 5 years, they have been setting up for a long-term war against Russia in Ukraine. Now, if you care about a group of people, do you try to turn their country into a battlefield? Is that what you do? Like, if I liked you, if I wished you well, I said, you watching at home, I'm your friend, I'm your buddy. So I'm going to go to your neighborhood and I'm going to set the stage for there to be killing and dying and death in your neighborhood for decades. That's what I would do if I really liked you. Give me a break. The CIA and the U.S. government has been trying to basically set up Ukraine to be the new Afghanistan. They want there to be blood, death, and killing, and Russians fighting Ukrainians in Ukraine for decades. That's what they want. They don't care about Ukrainians. They want Ukrainians to die so that they can use those corpses as propaganda against Russia, so they can do what they've been doing and use the conflict to mobilize the international community against Russia, to wage economic warfare against Russia. They don't care about Ukrainians. I care about Ukrainians. I want this war to end. I want Zelensky to negotiate, to stop listening to the Azov battalion, leave the people in the eastern regions alone, shut down the biolabs, shut down the Azov battalion, and then Russia will withdraw and leave, and that'll be that. Russia doesn't want to colonize Ukraine. They've got enough problems in Russia. They got drug gangs to deal with in Russia. They've got Islamic terrorist groups to deal with in Russia. They don't need a whole new republic, a new region where there's a lot of people who hate them that they have to control. Russia wants to get in there and get out. That's what they did in 2008, right? In 2008, Georgia attacked South Ossetia. So Russia retaliated against Georgia. They went in, they went out. And that's what Russia wants to do. I can guarantee you Putin wants to be out of Ukraine as fast as possible. He's there to draw a red line. You have to draw a red line somewhere, right? I mean, why in the world should Russia be expected to tolerate biological weapons facilities, Nazis, and slaughter of ethnic Russians on their border? Why in the world should they be expected to tolerate it? I'm so sick of, why is this so hard for people to understand? And people do understand this, but they're scared. People don't want to hear this. If you start telling this to people, they get scared because they see how hysterical the media is getting, and they're scared. Right? They're just scared, right? And they don't want to acknowledge this because it's scary to stand against the grain. Well, we have to be strong, right? We're a group of people. We are cultivating strength. And we, the Center for Political Innovation, we're the city building tendency. We have to be strong here. And we have to say, look, this is not what you want to hear. It's a hard thing to say, but we have to just hold the line and say Russia is not our enemy. Wall Street is our enemy. The Pentagon is our enemy. And Russia moving in to denazify Ukraine is not wrong. It's not wrong at all. But anyhow, just wanted to get to that. So next super chat question. Anti-Semitism in the USSR. Look, anti-Semitism in Russia has been a problem for many years. And there was anti-Semitism in the USSR. Yes, there was. the Soviet government did a lot to try and fight anti-Semitism. At one point in the Soviet Union, I believe there were newspapers that were, if a Jewish person changed their last name, they were writing their birth last name afterwards to like bait them for being Jewish. And I believe Stalin was the one who brought the end to that policy. And Soviet law forbid anti-Semitism, but there's anti-Semitism in the culture. I mean, that exists. And all forms of bigotry, all forms of racism are wrong. Now, part of the reason that there was a rise in anti-Semitism in the 1980s was for a couple reasons. First of all, the Soviet Union supported the Palestinians. They supported the Palestinian resistance. And so the United States was calling the Soviet Union anti-Semitic on that basis. And then the United States claimed that Soviet Jews were being persecuted because circumcision was not allowed. In the Soviet Union, you could not circumcise a child, right? The child is born, circumcision was not permitted. That was child abuse. That was like, no, you're not going to cut off the end of your child's, you know what? It's not going to happen. And other things like that were done that made Orthodox Jews and other religious Jewish communities feel persecuted. So because of that, the USA put sanctions on the USSR, alleging they were persecuting Soviet Jews. And then the Jewish Defense League, which was this crazy right-wing terrorist group in New York City, the JDL, started attacking Soviet diplomats in the United States. When the Soviet diplomats would like go take a walk in Central Park, the JDL would like attack them with lead pipes. And the Jewish Defense League, the JDL, also they threw smoke bombs and they shut down a circus, a Soviet circus that was performing, and a Soviet orchestra. And so in response to that, there were a lot of people in the Soviet Union who felt like, okay, there's some kind of Zionist conspiracy against us. There's some kind of Israeli plot against us. Well, I mean, that's not good, right? You should never, no form of ethnic bigotry is ever acceptable, right? And that was wrong. And then when the Soviet Union fell, right? The Soviet Union fell, the economy was falling apart. There was mass suffering in the country. A lot of Jews got to go to Israel. And so then there were a lot of Russians and, Ukrainians and Moldovans and other ethnic groups that are like, hey, wait a second, like, we're suffering here, but they just get a free trip to another country. That's not fair. And so on that basis, yes, in the former USSR, not just in Russia, but in many, many Eastern European countries, you do have anti-Semitism, and all forms of bigotry are not good. But that said, what the Ukrainian government is doing with the Azov battalion, with tearing down World War II memorials, with building this Nazi division of their military, which, having torchlit marches and honoring someone who carried out the Holocaust and murdered thousands of Jews and thousands of Poles, Stepan Bandera, that's at a whole nother level. Nothing like that is going on in Russia. Nothing like that would ever be allowed in Russia. Okay. So, it's like, is there ethnic bigotry in different countries around the world? Sure. What the USA is doing with their, U.S. National Guard training the Azov battalion, training these Nazis, these fanatical anti-Russian hate groups, this is on a completely different level. These people who say Hitler was right in World War II, there you go. But anyway, enough about that. That was just in response to that super chat. Divisions among, Chaya was pointing out when I was talking about the labor aristocracy, that's a big part of it. In the United States, white workers, a lot of them will identify with white capitalists against black workers. Now, it's not as bad as it used to be. And, the amount of support there has been for the black community against police brutality, the amount of racial integration there is. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many neighborhoods nowadays have people of many different races. I'm from a really small town in Ohio. Now, my town, the town I grew up in Ohio, it was about 15% black. And most of the towns around the town I grew up in Orville, Ohio, and most of the towns around Orville were all white, and people were like racist. We lived in a smaller town for the first few years of my childhood, and then we moved there. And I remember like my parents said, when we told them we were moving to Orville, people would say like, there's black people there, right? I mean, the racism was pretty unbelievable. And people would say outrageous things, ridiculous things because this town had black people in it. But now if you go to the part of, I know I keep up with what goes on in my hometown. I haven't been back there in a few years, but, the graduating class at my high school has a lot of black folks, but it has a lot of folks from India, of Indian heritage, has a lot of Latino folks, middle America, small towns, rural America is much more racially integrated than ever before. and there's a lot more interracial marriages, and there's a lot more people of different races living in their communities. It's not like it was. And that's not to say that there aren't problems. Of course there are problems. I mean, look, there's a lot of anti-immigrant bigotry out there. There's a lot of, there's obviously, during the Trump years, there was kind of a rise of some of these white supremacist groups, Richard Spencer type people, but that's so there's definitely problems, right? But the amount of racial integration in the United States, most workplaces in the United States are integrated. Most schools in the United States are integrated. I mean, yes, there are divisions, but I would say the segregation tends to happen more in urban areas, and people don't want to talk about this. But, if you go to a working class community in the South, you can go to a McDonald's, and working in the McDonald's, there'll be black people and there'll be white people, and eating at the McDonald's, there'll be black people and there'll be white people. However, if you go to, a wealthy wealthy hipster neighborhood in Brooklyn, you go to Williamsburg, the white people, there'll be a restaurant, it'll be white people, rich white kids eating there, and it'll be people of color working there, right? And that workplaces in urban centers, these liberal hipster urban centers, tend to be way more segregated, right? And that, a friend of mine went to prison. She was an Occupy Wall Street activist. She did some time, and she was from a small town in Texas. She grew up in a trailer. I remember one thing that she talked about is when she was in on Rikers Island in the women's jail facility. She talked about how most of almost every one of her cellmates were black, and they all assumed she must be wealthy because she's white, because they didn't know that a poor white person existed. If you grew up in New York City, you wouldn't know that low-income white people who live in trailers, white people who listen to country music, white people who, have had relatives in prison, white people who've had relatives in the military, you wouldn't know they existed, right? And that in the urban gentrified hipster centers, there's a lot more racial segregation than in working class areas. In working class areas, you have people white and black in the same job. You have people white and black, owning businesses. You have people white and black in the same neighborhoods. Working class middle America is much more racially integrated than the hipster liberal urban centers. What's hilarious is that in the hipster urban liberal centers, you have this political correctness where they think that they are like, they know like the right things to say. They all went to college and they took gender studies and queer studies and race studies. And so they can give you the script. These urban white kids can give you the script. They know all the right words to say. Whereas low-income white workers might not know all the rules, and they might say things, and they might have bigoted attitudes, and they might deny that white privilege exists and such. But at the end of the day, in their workplace, in their neighborhood, it's going to be much more racially integrated. And that's a dirty little secret that people don't want to talk about. The ruling class, the propaganda, the anti-working class propaganda now that all white workers are all a bunch of redneck Klansmen. And, the urban hipster liberals are just, they have hearts of gold and they just care about people of color. That doesn't match at all. Does not match at all. And that's one of the dirty little secrets of the United States. Right. And so just wanted to reflect on that. I don't know how we got on that, but anyway, Daniel Estulin. All right. And if there's any other questions, seems to be like the last super chat question I've got. Daniel Estulin is a writer. I believe he's from Eastern Europe, and he writes primarily in Spanish, I think, but he also speaks English. But I think his work is originally published in Spanish, if I'm not mistaken. And Fidel Castro quoted him, and he talks about the synthetic left. He talks about the Congress for Cultural Freedom program and the Institute for Policy Studies and the Frankfurt School and stuff like that. And some of the stuff he says, I don't know, like, again, some of the stuff he says needs to be pointed out. But then sometimes, honestly, I read a lot of his books. I've read a couple of his books, and they get a little off course, right? I mean, it's like he's saying true things, and then he gets to the point where he's saying things that I don't quite buy. So, but Fidel Castro quoted him and devoted a number of his columns to quoting him. Fidel Castro, there's a reason Fidel Castro quoted him. And the reason for that is because Fidel Castro was warning about the synthetic left. Fidel Castro, he retired, and in his final years of life, Obama was president. And he was seeing how U.S. imperialism was starting to do that woke makeover, where they attack countries on the basis of being more racially integrated, etc. And basically, Fidel Castro saw that the synthetic left that the U.S. imperialists created with Project MK Ultra and the 1960s drug culture, the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, which is totally real, by the way. These are documented facts, right? Google Congress for Cultural Freedom. I didn't make that up. That's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy. That's fact. Okay, it has nothing to do with Jews. It has nothing to do with the Nazi theory of cultural Bolshevism. In the 1950s, the CIA started funding leftists that were anti-communists, and that's fact. And they created Partisan Review magazine, and they created Encounter magazine, and they subsidized the work of Herbert Marcuse. These are facts, okay? And you can deny them all day long, and you can say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, but just because you don't agree with it doesn't make it a conspiracy theory. And yes, there are people who talk about it and say things that then can't be proven, but that doesn't change it. And tomorrow I'm going to have an interesting stream with a few guests. I don't want to get into what it's about, but you'll see tomorrow. It's going to be a little bit of fun. But these are facts. The Congress for Cultural Freedom happened. MK Ultra, where the CIA was promoting drug use and spreading drugs around the United States, that happened. These are facts. These are facts. And so, there you go. But anyway, Isaiah, I'll just answer this. Books on the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers. The Cultural Cold War. That's another very good book on the topic. There's a number of books about the CIA's program. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program it was directed by Irving Kristol. It included the Trotskyite professor Sidney Hook. It's a documented fact. The CIA bragged about it on their website. The fact that people want to call it a conspiracy theory shows that they're just disingenuous. That's what liberals think they can do now. The biolabs are real. Hunter Biden's laptop is real, but they think that they can make it not real by just saying, well, that's a conspiracy theory. And the same with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This is a fact. But they can just say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, and then it just magically goes away. It doesn't go away. You can Google this. This is a fact, right? It's a fact. And it's rather frustrating to see that there are some people that are just so thought-conforming. Liberals have become what conservatives were during the Bush years. During the Bush years, if you said, hey, the USA actually used to arm Saddam Hussein and supported him against Iran, they'd say, that's a conspiracy theory. And you'd say, no, that's actually a fact. Here's a picture of Donald Rumsfeld shaking his hand. No, that's a conspiracy theory. And that's how liberals are these days. And it's rather frustrating to see. And that's the argument that these people have. You bring up the biolabs and they say that's a conspiracy theory. And it's like, we've got video of Victoria Nuland talking about it. Nope, it's a conspiracy theory. Hunter Biden's laptop, that's a conspiracy theory. Well, no, the New York Times admits it's real and stuff. No, it's a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory. This is how these people talk now. It is so ridiculous. And it's just like, they basically have said, I will turn my brain off. I will turn my brain off. And it's like, at that point, you can't argue with someone who's that ridiculous. In a couple of years, they're going to tell us the Vietnam War was a conspiracy theory. You're going to say, hey, the USA killed millions of people in Vietnam. And they're going to say, no, it didn't. No, it didn't. That's communist propaganda. You heard that from Putin. You must have heard that on CGTN. That didn't happen. You're going to say the USA invaded Iraq and there were no weapons of mass destruction. And they're going to say, no, you saw that on RT, didn't you? You saw that. I bet you heard that from Jimmy Dore. These people are just thoughtless conformists, basically. They're just conformists. They're afraid of thinking. They don't want to question authority. And they then think that they get to tell those of us who believe in socialism what we believe. Well, no, you don't. No, you don't. We are going to stand up. We're going to get out of the movement. We're going to get to the masses. We're going to fight for the working class. Out of the movement to the masses. Dare to struggle, dare to win. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. All right, folks. Looks like we're done. In the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. So, yeah, folks, the danger of a new world war still exists. The people of all countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Out of the movement to the masses, dare to struggle, dare to win. Have a good night, everybody.